So welcome to the first of a new series, which is looking to revisit some of the Whitley Lectures, which were relaunched in 1996 with the lecture that we're looking at this evening, Power and Discipleship by Nigel Wright. The Whitley Lecture had been around since the middle of the 20th century in honor of W.T. Whitley, who was a famous Baptist historian, an educator and theologian, and in different ways, there were lectures for through the 60s and 70s, but then it was relaunched after a long gap in 1996, and Nigel Wright was asked to be the first Whitley lecturer, and they've been given pretty much every year since then. And over this year together, month by month, we're going to revisit and look at some of them. Obviously, there's been at least 25, if not more, so we won't be able to look at all of them, but we'll look at a selection of them. And engage their ideas, and hopefully sometimes we'll be able to engage with the actual lecturer who delivered them, and for some interesting conversation, and for help us to think through some of the issues again as we engage with it. And so this evening we're looking at, as I've already said, Power and Discipleship. If you had a copy, I think you can still get a copy, but it's a free PDF. A little blue cover, Towards a Baptist Theology of the State. And Nigel had completed his PhD in 1994 from King's College London, and this is very much a chapter, I think, probably from that PhD, or it was pulled from that. And his PhD was published in 2000 under the title Disavowing Constantine, and it was a political theology engaging with Jürgen Moltmann and John Howard Yoder. And here is part of that, what he's doing in the Whitley Lecture for that year. The lecture begins by just talking a little bit how Christians are inherently political. When I gave my own Whitley lecture a couple of years ago, which in one sense was inspired by Nigel's, I reiterated that point. We can't avoid being political as Christians. It's part of who we are if we confess Jesus is Lord. And Nigel begins there and then gives out a little quick summary of different ways that is played out. He calls it court theology, where the church has been very close to the state. Eusebius is given as the example. Then there's, at the other end of the spectrum, there's withdrawal theology, and he gives the example to Tertullian, where very much the church wants to distinguish itself quite sharply from the state and withdraw from any sense of being part of the state in that way. And then he looks at Augustine, who kind of is caught in the middle a little bit with his City of God, his most famous treatment of political theology, that sense of an uneasy relationship between church and state, which I guess is a little bit where Nigel wants to end up, although his journey comes from a different place as a Baptist and with Anabaptist concerns and interests. He then gives a little bit of just the story of who Baptists were and who Anabaptists were. Nigel, in the late 1970s, if not the early 80s, had become enamored with Anabaptism, and that flows throughout his work that he's published, this interest in Anabaptism as a Baptist, though. I don't think he loses that sense of Baptist, but he thinks Anabaptism has got something to say to Baptists. And so he makes a little bit of conversation about that. Anabaptists being much more suspicious of the state, where Baptists have been, I guess, a sense of positive. The distinguishing often is if you are an Anabaptist, you didn't believe that you could be a magistrate. Baptists believed actually that was something that you could do as a citizen of wherever you were. He then engages with this conversation around powers, looking at the work of Walter Wink and Milbank, before then giving his definition of what he thinks a theological understanding, or a Baptist theological understanding of the state would be, before some concluding remarks. I'm just going to quickly, so in my Whitley lecture, I kind of tried to summarize Nigel's position. It was the bit of the Whitley lecture, whenever I presented it, I didn't read this bit because of time. And so I'm going to read this bit now, considering I wrote it, which gives a little bit more of a summary before we have some conversation. Nigel Wright's Whitley Lecture was a presentation of a Baptist theology of the state. He acknowledges he is not the first Baptist to engage in this area, but he claims that other attempts have been surprisingly meagre. Wright's political theology is centered on an understanding of church and state, captured in the title of his 2005 work, Free Church, Free State. Politics begins with the church, he says. It has priority of importance because it is the locus of God's mission. The church, for Wright, is God's primarily earthly instrument for the reconciliation of the world. And I'm quoting here from the lecture, Power and Discipleship. The church stands at variance to human society, shaped by its new way of life based upon forgiveness and mutual service. In this way, being the church is a political act. This distinct way of the church's life reflects, he says, its missionary nature as a witnessing community whose vocation is for the whole world. The state follows the church in theological ordering, but is nonetheless ordained by God, provisionally as a current means of restraining chaos and anarchy. Wright sees a positive role for the state, although one set within certain bounds. A key word he uses in relation to the state is ambivalent or ambiguous. Behind this, following Walter Wink, is an understanding that the state is one of the powers that is simultaneously good, fallen, and in need of redemption. The state's primary role is the maintenance of justice, peace, and freedom, he says. And this policing function, at its best, is essential to reducing and overcoming violence. The state can also have a more beneficial purpose, where it is used to undergird the weak and holds a covenantal understanding of humanity that builds and practices community and cooperation. A Baptist political theology, he says, supports the state in these aims, but he argues clearly that the state should be religiously neutral. In this way, both church and state remain free. Neither can impose themselves on the other. This leads him to argue for the disestablishment of the Church of England, and he also says no consistent Baptist can approve of the sacral state or anything that looks like it. Again, Nigel has been a champion and often actually where we haven't talked about it as much, at least through the 1990s and onwards, that actually we should be arguing more loudly for the disestablishment of the Church of England. The state is secular, yet should not be secularist. The church and state should not be indifferent. There can, says Wright, be space and opportunity for cooperation as long as religious impartiality is upheld. In his work disavowing Constantine, here I come out of the lecture a little bit, Wright gives more attention to the relationship between church and state and outlines a position which he later calls participating without possessing. Here I want to focus on two of the theses he presents. Firstly, Wright argues that the cause of Christ can never be advanced by worldly means or alliances with the state. This is an argument for separation of church from state, what he calls a critical distancing. Wright follows this with the contention that this does not imply the separation of church from society, and as such the church molds society wherever possible according to its pattern of social existence in Christ. This molding of society is done by faithfully being the church, participating constructively in the social order and the intermediate structure of society, and through political participation. Faithfully being the church draws on this concept of the church as a witnessing community. He says at the end of his Whitley lecture, a pace setter for the wider world. The church has its own politics as a messianic communities shaped by the politics of Jesus, which it offers the world. Wright is insistent that any political theology comes from a renewed reflection on the meaning of Christ for the complexities of our world. In Challenge to Change, he speaks of a positive nonconformity grounded in Christ-focused living. If he speaks of the ambivalence of the state, he also uses the word positive at various points to articulate a political position that is about what the church is for and not just what it's against. If being faithful says the church stands apart from the world, Wright's other two forms of molding are about participation in society. This participation is practiced not by a gathered church, but a scattered one. And so Wright switches from the language of the church to that of the Christian. He says towards the end of Power and Discipleship, individual members of the church will be scattered throughout all organs of society. They will sometimes subvert the system when its idolatries become clear. They will sometimes affirm and strengthen that which corresponds to God's purposes for creation. They will seek for those modest and sometimes radical improvements which are signs that the world's redemption is near. This argument for participating without possessing leads Wright to see the possibility, later at least, of a non-Constantinian Christendom, in which any adherence to the Christian faith, or any faith, is gained and maintained through voluntary means alone. This would have commonality with the historic Baptist position. A Christendom of this kind would be the grounding of a healthy, tolerant, and free society. It has similarities with what he terms soft secularism. A hard secularism reduces all religious beliefs and practices to the private sphere. A soft secularism is open to their contribution in the public arena. Wright believes that faith groups should have access to public debate and political bodies in recognition of their contribution to the moral formation of citizens, their involvement in local communities, and the social capital they generate. This would be on the basis of merit, competence, and intellectual coherence. Wright recognizes that this proposed political theology will not be without tension and practice. he says that it is surely to be expected. What is necessary is to contend for new understandings of what it means to be free. So that's my attempt to kind of summarize Nigel's understanding of the state and the church from the lecture, but also bringing in some of his later work as well. So there we have it. That's what Nigel makes the argument for. I guess here, hopefully, is some interesting conversation about what we make of it, 25, if not more years on, and closer to 30 years on, I guess now. And what does it say to us still in our context? Is there something different we'd want to say? Are there things that actually we want to question about Nigel's argument? What have you made of it? Go for it, Sally. Yeah, everyone just jump in. Yeah.
Okay, I'll kick off with something that I was thinking while you were talking just then. So you were talking about the engagement of faith groups in society as a positive thing because of bringing this kind of witness of Christ into, or indeed if it was another faith group, some other kind of moral witness. Do you think that depends or is affected by the need for a shared ultimate sense of authority? I'm just thinking about a conversation we had with some students yesterday about it was in pastoral care actually, but about the purpose of pastoral care, which we were talking about whether the purpose of pastoral care is actually to help people to grow up in Christ, to encourage Christ-likeness as much as anything else. And some of the students were saying, oh yes, but we can't do that because some of the people we meet outside the church are not going to be Christians. And this led into an interesting discussion about the fact that God is God, and just because people don't believe in him doesn't mean that he's not there anymore, and this sort of thing. And I'm just wondering whether there's a similar kind of trajectory around this, whether the faith groups moral position, which we would perceive to be good, would even be accepted as legitimate in today's postmodern culture.
That's a great question to kick us off with, Sally. What do people think?
Just a little bit. So what's the question kind of around, does God operate through other faith communities that wouldn't name themselves?
No,
that's not what you're asking.
Not really. It's more grasping after McIntyre, I think, that Nigel talks a lot about the palimpsest, doesn't he? And whether there's actually a recognition of the authority within faith, whether it's Christian, Muslim, or anything else. But actually, it seems to me that postmodernism has gone so far that almost doesn't exist anymore. And therefore, is it still possible for the church or any other faith group to mould or model in society in the way that Nigel hopes in his lecture? Is there even a conversation? Are we speaking the same language because of our commitment to some kind of authority beyond ourselves, which most of modern culture wouldn't understand because of the relocation of authority in the individual?
I guess my sense, Nigel would, because he wants to hold very clearly to a free church and free state, as long as that moulding is not done in a way that seeks to possess and take over and is more a form of witnessing, he would say that, I think following Howard, Yoder, McClendon and others, I guess, says the church's job is to witness. And so that's how we participate. So that's his language, isn't it? We participate without possessing.
Yes.
And I guess that if that's really clear in how we're witnessing and how we seek to participate, I don't see how anyone can have a problem with that. Although I can perceive that people would have a problem with that, potentially.
Yeah.
But
I suppose my question is, would the witness be even understood or perceived because of where it's coming, the place that it comes from?
yes,
Yeah.
I think. Sorry, go on, you, Ed. Go on, Ed.
Edward.
I think it's a really interesting and quite a searching question, Sally. And I just wonder. I was wondering, as you asked the question, whether it's not simply that the place that we're coming from, let's assume that's where we're coming from, a position of faith and authority beyond ourselves. I'm not sure whether that is the problem. In Nigel, in his lecture, I think quoted Milbank, where he spoke about the persistence of the second text. Don't know if you remember this.
Just having a look to see if I can find it.
The distortion, quote, the distortion of God's original creation text by dominium, the use of dominating force. But then he says, indeed, not only has the church become implicated in this text, it continues to write it.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really insightful statement. And I just wonder whether there is a lack of resonance within culture for what the church has to say in terms, particularly when we are seeking greater justice, changing values towards peace and all this kind of stuff. I think there is just a lack of resonance, and I think people from a deep place just say, well, it's the very text that you're writing. You are part of the power, and the church has become so, it's so deep within it and writes. Do you see what I'm saying?
Which is really interesting, because the church, I think, sometimes doesn't feel like we have that power any longer.
No.
Or at least parts of the church, and we might be Baptist with that. But yeah, Simon, you wanted to.
Yeah, I was going to say now. I was teasing out something to do with this idea of where authority lies, and I think quite often Christians kind of behave as if the world ought to give a damn about any authority that we claim for ourselves or the God that we worship. And I don't. I guess I hear Nigel here saying, why should they? Because they're not playing by the same rules. They're not reading the same script that we're reading, but that doesn't invalidate the truth that we are living. So I don't think it matters that the shift into postmodernity and the demise of the meta-narrative or the internalization of morality within the individual. I don't think it matters to Christian witness that stuff is now the context within which the church exists, because our role is to live the truth of what is revealed to us and to shape a community around that truth. And if we are right, and the Christ path is the best way of being human, then that is a good for society. Whether society accepts the authority that we're basing it on or not kind of doesn't matter. It's still a good that we're offering to society more widely, and something we can contribute into society structures by participating in politics. And it's good to have Christians getting elected and that kind of stuff, not in order to get the Christian witness at the heart of government, but in order that the better way of being human that we are given in Christ is made available for others to participate in also. And that feels to me like that's the kingdom of God at work in the world. We have a phrase that we use in our prayers sometimes at Bloomsbury, which some of you may know this or not. This phrase, living as if it were true until it is true. And that kind of kept going through my head as I was rereading the lecture earlier. It's like our job is just to live this reality into being until it is true, because we believe that it's true, even if others don't.
I guess go, Sally.
Well, I didn't want to. I mean, I agree with you, actually, Simon, except that a little bit of me is nagging away with Paul Fiddy's thing about covenant, that if there is this sort of true relationship dialogue between individuals, then each must mutually impact the other, or each must impact the other to something. That there has to be that sort of porosity to the other. There has to be that porosity for change, in order for it to be a genuine dialogue or relationship. And I'm just wondering whether we are approaching the point where that our languages are so different that it's hard to understand how that dialogue can happen. I fully agree that, you know, we have our witness to live and we must inhabit that, because that's what we're called to do. But yeah, I'm just sort of scratching my head about some of this how impactful it is in current
Yeah,
culture.
I mean, Nigel talks about covenant towards the end, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He does.
He sort of roots the relationship between church and society and state, where he's got a teasing out between society and state. He kind of roots that in the language of covenant as well.
He does.
Noting that the state is rooted in domination and that the Christian community is rooted in liberation, and that's what we bring to a dominated society.
But I think part of his argument is that the state doesn't have to be rooted in domination. You know, so I thought there was a really interesting bit where he says, page 33, what is this? Indeed, the more effectively, so it's near the end of that page, indeed, the more effectively a state is able to function as what William Temple called a welfare state, the less necessary it will be to act as a power state. So I think this is part of what Nigel wants to say. There is a better way of the state being the state. And you know, so I think there are a couple of things I wanted to, you know, first of all, I have in the background Rowan Williams' phrase that our nation is haunted by Christianity. And I think, you know, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not, or whatever, you can't get away from that, because that's just our story, our nation's story. I think the second thing is, I think Nigel would want to say that the church and all Christian groups, all faith groups and non-faith groups in the state, his vision of a free state, a secular state, should have a fair hearing. That doesn't mean that they have to be accepted, but there should be a fair hearing. There should be an attempt actually to listen. For me, this picks up some of the work of Luke Bretherington, a political theologian who's got Anglican and Pentecostal roots. He's very big on this sense of actually we need to do much more listening to one another in all sorts of different ways. And I think Nigel was kind of in that place. I guess the third thing is that I think Nigel would also want to say, and I think probably would want to say together, the church's witness, because of our history, needs to be in a much more humbler key than perhaps we might have done in the past. And again, I guess the interesting thing I think here is for Baptists, because we've never had the kind of power that other denominations had. Or, you know, we had our moment, if you know the history, which is kind of the end of the 20th century, where we were able, with the other nonconformists, to almost pick the government. But that quickly fell away, and, you know, we lost that. But generally, our place has been one of
we had the parliaments of the saints in the 17th century. What are you worried about?
Well, they didn't go so well, did they? In lots of ways. So, you know. So I think this is where, for me, I think Nigel's work is really interesting. He doesn't just talk about the church, a theology of the church. He talks about a theology of the state. Actually, we need to be talking about what a good state, what a positive state looks like, as well. As you know, and almost as an argument, come on, state, we expect you to do better as much as the church should do better.
I don't know whether I'm taking a overly critical read of this. I mean, a question I would have asked Nigel if he'd been able to be with us is, do you still agree with what you've written here? And to what degree would you have changed? And okay, this is a really critical comment. On page 31, he says, here we reinforce the primary role of the state, which has to do with the maintenance of justice, peace, and freedom. And I just want to say, do you really believe the role of the state is justice, peace, and freedom. And I'm not convinced that it is. I think the role of the state, as we see exercised, that it just seems a little bit idealistic, even, and this is the critical bit. I think it's quite naive, because the role of the state, as I see it, is the maintenance of law rather than justice. It is the maintenance of peace, whatever peace means, in order that the powerful might continue in their position of power and continue doing what they do. And justice, peace, and freedom, I've no idea what Nigel really means by freedom. So,
well,
yeah.
Surely what he means by freedom, at least in part, is that the church is free. And so the idea that, the state could dictate to the church and to any other faith groups how it should order its life and et cetera, that's part of what he means by freedom. And I guess he means also the freedom of the individual. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, freedom, yes. But I think a classic example recently has been the Israel-Gaza situation, where is the church free? Yes. But as soon as a churchman stands up and speaks on behalf of the suffering in Gaza, they are drowned out by the state very, very quickly. And I just think, okay, well, is that freedom?
But that's where he says the state is always created good and fallen. And the term that I think is a very helpful term, which we'd always have in mind, is that the state is ambiguous. So I actually think in some senses he has a realistic view of the state.
I thought that whole comment about being both good and bad at the same time, and all that whole discussion was very good.
Which I think we can also say is true of the church, probably. Well, not probably, definitely.
Well, even Augustine thought that, didn't he? But it does say earlier in the lecture, doesn't he, Ed, that the state's role is to kind of control anarchy, or chaos or whatever, to hold it back. So I think that he kind of says that on the one hand, and then the justice, peace, and freedom thing at a later point. So I suppose he's kind of fulfilling his own good and bad thing within the lecture. Yeah.
I think one thing that's interesting is since Nigel wrote that, we had a new Labour government, which completely changed the relationship between church and state. And actually, I think that's continued a little bit with the governments that followed, in that actually the state began to look to the church to play a role in a way that it hadn't done. There's a reading, I don't know whether it originates with Sam Wells, but with others, basically, the welfare state, when it emerged, basically took a lot of the church's activity away from them and gave it back and took it under the kind of state's role. Since kind of, in lots of ways, that's been returning, especially since 2010, and the church has become a lot more active again in providing services and things like that. And so I think the relationship between church and state is and how that's managed in terms of grants, that churches can apply for. We might also bring in, which I did at the end of my Whitley lecture, the kind of but also the relationship between church and charity and the Charity Commission. That's where I think, does Nigel's thing still stand up, or actually has some of the situation between church and state changed, which means that he might want to change some of the things that he said there, or nuance them, or say new things.
What do you think Anglicans might think of this lecture?
I think you'd have to ask which Anglican you were asking. I think there were some who quite like it, probably, but others would definitely,
I guess I'm just thinking about, how our relationship to the state as a persecuted church is entirely different to the church, the established state church.
Mm.
And I don't really see, I mean, I guess it's somewhere else in the thesis. I don't really see it in this chapter about how our identity is formed by our relationship to the state as beginning in persecution and then never actually really being welcomed to the table in the same way, because we have a massive House of Lords full of bishops who provide the spiritual wisdom for the government, do they not? In some way, in a functional way.
But I think interesting there. I don't think Nigel does this, but we do it. We've forgotten that history of where we began. And actually, if you asked quite a lot of Baptists, they would probably be quite happy that there are bishops in the House of Lords. And we've, Nigel for me has been one of the very few voices that has pushed and argued for this establishment of the Church of England. Most of us are quite happy for it to continue in some form, because actually it feels like, or has felt like, it helps our own witness, and it helps, I guess, to go back to some of our, helps the nation remain somewhat Christian. And I think that's the interesting. Yes. How do we? Yeah.
That's what my colleagues would say, that it's a good thing to have. I mean, I don't agree, but my Anglican colleagues would say it's a good thing because it places Christianity at the heart of the House of Lords. There's a voice there that is guaranteed because of that interconnection of church and state. It's not, I don't agree with that, but that's definitely, they feel that quite strongly. I think that it's a privilege. They recognise it, some of them, as a privilege that other people don't have, but they think ultimately it's a good thing for the whole church.
See, I guess I have a problem with the monopoly of the Church of England in the House of Lords.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have a problem actually if there was a diversity of faith, which might mean Church of England, Baptist, Methodist, and many other different faith voices there. Because again, I think in a secular state, there is a place for what we might, what I think Nigel wants to say. There's a place for us, we are rooted in local communities and have that kind of sense. Yeah, I think my problem is the monopoly of the Anglican bishops and their presumption, or the presumption of Anglicans to speak for all of Christianity and all faith communities. That's some of the language that they use. We're there to speak on your behalf, but to which we said, have we ever asked you, and do you ever ask us? But anyway, yeah,
I do wonder, Andy. I think your kind of dating of this lecture in 1996, just before a massive Labour victory, and already the tide, I think, was turning in terms of looking for a different way for a government to live and act and so on. And I think in the ensuing years after that victory in 97, I think there was a different feel about government and relationship with church and all that kind of stuff. Interestingly, Nigel, on page 8 of his lecture, when he's retelling kind of history, the final sentence in the paragraph, at the same time, the subversive memory of Christianity's radical and countercultural origins were kept alive, possibly in a somewhat domesticated form, through the growth of the monastic movement. And I think the whole argument of all bishops are in the House of Lords, it's still a Christian country. I think the difficulty here, and again, I would love to have asked Nigel this, is surely all that is part of the domestication of the church by the state. And where is the subversion of the state? Where is the subversion of the elite? Where is the tripping up of those in power by those?
Although interestingly, since the 1980s, the Church of England had become more subversive. Faith in the City report, Runcie and the Falklands War. Williams wasn't afraid to dissent from government. Welby hasn't been afraid. So actually, they've become a little bit more subversive in different ways. I still think it's the presumption that they speak still from in a relative position of power. But I don't think the Church of England, in many ways, is now the supporter of the state, at least as it was in previous generations. which I think is I think this goes back to Sally's question. We're in a different place now. Lots of things which were kind of fixed are unraveling. And I guess my thing about why Nigel's work I think is really important, and I don't know whether Baptists have paid enough attention to it, at least the political theology stuff, is we don't think about these issues anymore. We have become fairly inoculated and comfortable. Yes, we'll we don't like the idea of more food banks and other things like that, but actually the whole kind of church state, I don't really see any kind of serious engagement or thinking, which is part of the reason my Whitley lecture was on the theme that it was. That actually I don't think we've paid enough attention. And Nigel has been really a sole voice in these issues for a long time. But I think most Baptists have been kind of, well, it kind of works for us now, the church state kind of relationship,
Well, that's because we got drawn in under Cameron, the big society agenda. I mean, that was just,
I think probably before that, actually, under Labour, really, because Labour was chucking money left, right, and centre to faith communities, and
And then, but I mean, the language around big society. I remember hearing Steve Chalk at one point saying this is, the greatest opportunity for the church in a generation to re-engage with the stuff. And I thought, I mean, I like Steve immensely and agree with him on a lot of stuff, but I thought you're completely wrong. They're just trying to do the same deal with us that redo the Christendom deal. They're trying to buy us off money and a bone or two of power from on high in order that
OBEs
not only do their job for them, but legitimate and enable them. And we end up becoming the enablers of a dysfunctional and oppressive government because it makes us feel good about ourselves because we get a little bit of power and some money. And I think it's entirely the wrong way around.
So but that comes back to, I think, and this is part of what Nigel's lecture is about, isn't it? We don't want to take the Tertullian route and be completely outside and non-participating, but any attempt to begin to participate is ambiguous and can quite easily be co-opted and tainted. And it's that care, which Baptists are not really known for their care of we're so pragmatic, we just get on with it. We're not, for me, known of that care to actually distinguish what's going on here and when to say yes and perhaps when to say no. And Can
I take us in a slightly different direction? Can I ask a question about the use of force or violence? Because I think it's interesting the way he kind of frames that as, it's okay as long as you're in effect acting as the policeman. And I have some sympathy for that, because if somebody broke into my house this evening, I'd quite like a policeman to come around and stop them. So, I'm not against the appropriate use of force. And he's right that historically Baptists have engaged in these things. And, we've not historically been a peace church, although there are Baptist peace congregations now. But I think it almost reads like it's kind of okay for Baptists to, join the army, which, as long as the army is always going to do the right thing. And I have a bit of a concern about that in terms of, you give your allegiance to serve king and country, you're going to end up fighting wars that are in the interests of the economic benefit of your country, not necessarily in the interests of being the world's policeman, ensuring peace and justice for all around the world. And I kind of wanted to push back a bit on that, not all the way back, but I wanted to push back a bit. It felt like a slightly uncritical acceptance of Baptist involvement in potentially violent structures of society.
I'm really glad you raised that, because I was thinking slightly differently about this, but my question actually relates, I'm sorry, to the thing I was discussing before about the mutual influence of church and state. But if the role of the state is to deal with violence in some way, I think my question is, can violence actually be dealt with from without, or must it be dealt with from within? Is it, where does violence start? Sure, it starts internally, doesn't it? There is something dysfunctional deep within, dysfunctional about relational capacity or whatever else. And so again, that I think this question about violence and the state's role in that is really important, but it also raises for me this other question about whether that's actually possible to really deal with that. I mean, it's sin and salvation, isn't it? And
I think it raises the question of the nature of God. I mean, I've often heard in Anabaptist peace circles, people in effect framing the argument, God does the violence, so we don't have to. So, God will sort it out by condemning people and judging them, so we can be peaceful and leave it to God. And I've always thought it's the wrong way around. If God is violent, then we can be violent. The only path towards non-violence is a recognition that God is inherently non-violent, which is kind of that false thing. And then I guess what God is the state engaging with, and what God are we as Christians engaging with? It's John Colwell's question, what God and so what? What God are we actually believing in here, and what are we going to do about it in our relationships and our behaviours?
Yes, it comes to a point of how do we deal with resisting evil? And at some point, evil has to be resisted. But I think Nigel's point is still even with I think the key thing he wants to say is, as far as I can read him, is the state is ambiguous, and so its resistance will not always be, a resistance that we would be happy with as the church. And I guess that's where we might call it out. And partly, again, I think Runcie and Rowan Williams later with the Iraq War attempted to do that. There may have needed to be some resistance, but let's not couch any of this in terms of good and evil, and we're good and the other side are evil. Yes, on this side of the eschaton, how we deal with resisting evil, I think becomes really tricky. I guess with my Hawass kind of voice in the background, I guess part of it is we lack the imagination to respond to resisting evil, and without quickly going to the use of force. Maybe there are sometimes other means to do it, and sometimes we lack the imagination to do that, and we quite quickly jump to the use of force.
We shouldn't.
Valerie, have you been trying to say something? Sorry if we've been.
I think that is the difficulty when you're coming to, particularly I'm thinking at the moment about that we've endured 7 weeks of people demonstrating in things that really, and actions that were against, what we would regard as proper protest kind of thing. And the difficulty is if you don't do anything about that, and then everybody in Parliament's calling for a 2-state solution, but you can't have a 2-state solution unless both parties are signed up to it. And that's where I think you have got the difficulty, because Hamas has already said it has no intention of signing up to it. And you're back into the thing about how far do you let it go? And if you had said to Hitler, when he went into the Sudetenland, no, naughty behavior, maybe it would have been, I'm not saying it would have been different, but maybe it would have given pause. But there comes a point where you actually have to do it. And I think that's the difficulty. And it's the same with Justin Welby. We were talking about Justin Welby during the pandemic. I have a great deal of problem with that, because I think that to allow the churches to be closed, I'm not saying that people could have met in the pandemic, but I think that to allow the churches to be closed for the first time since 1300 or something was a bad move.
I think he has said he regrets that, and yes, I guess it's I guess some of what you're saying about is as soon as we begin to open up this, is we have to make judgments and decisions, and sometimes they're not this is such a tricky area, isn't it? I think when you get into church, if we just retreated and the church was the church, back to the Tertullian withdrawal, we can imagine this pure way of being, although actually it wouldn't be that pure, because the state and others would begin to encroach on us all the time. So it seems to me that it's impossible to act out. But so at some point you have to engage with it. And Nigel wanting to say, the good created good and fallen means that there's going to be good and there's going to be fallen, and we're caught in the mess of it. It's back to Augustine, the wheat and the tares, and I guess what I welcome from Nigel is that Nigel says, well, let's be engaged in that conversation. And too much perhaps the church has not engaged in political theology, you know, to give it its broadest terms. We haven't done the thinking about, you know, we haven't done thinking about issues of war and peace. We haven't done, you know, those are not on our engagement on our radar now, in a way that perhaps in previous generations they would have been, especially, you know, you go back to 18th and 19th, where we were still the kind of dissenting, fighting for our voice. You know, the 20th century settlement actually meant, you know, we stopped doing political theology and engaging, I think, largely, which
Rob,
means that, yeah, sorry, yeah, someone.
Rob, you were going to come in. You had your finger up.
Yes, Rob, go.
Well, has anybody read Joshua Searle wrote an article, How Putin Cured Me of My Pacifism? I don't know if anyone's written it, but it's a really interesting, enticing title. And I'd love to know his argument for that, because I'm sure he'd probably love to hold a radical pacifist kind of idealist thing, and then Putin invaded his beloved Ukraine, and etc. etc. So that kind of reality check.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I struggle. I mean, Simon, back to your line of thinking, the relationship between a Christian being a police officer who may not be required to use lethal force, although there's some police may be required to use lethal force, but some form of resistance, and those which is implicitly lethal. So the army, much as you want to frame it in a kind of for the good of X, Y, and Z, ultimately this is an institution trained to kill. I remember visiting Hereford Cathedral and seeing the little bit of the Hereford Cathedral dedicated to the SAS, the most lethal killing machine that sanctified within that. So, I mean, what I remember, I was there in '96 in Spurgeon's College when Nigel delivered this, and it was the first time I'd ever heard anything like this at all. And I've always liked the fact that there's an honesty to it that lives with that, exactly that language, the ambiguity and the ambivalence, and he just has to say you have to stay away from a totalitarianism of the state, which has become idolatrous and refuses to recognize anything other than itself, a transcendent reality, and where church and state have collapsed completely, and you're always oscillating between those. But those are the two things that cause you to be concerned. And the last thing I'll say, I mean, it is interesting. We've got the most right-wing government in anyone's lifetime currently at the moment, and so you do wonder about, Sally, you said it and others have said it, about the voice of religion at that level and how seriously it's taken, and there is that dissenting voice there, but actually is anybody paying attention to it at all? But I'm probably with Simon. Why on earth should the state pay any attention to us at all? And I think the role of the church has been restored to our local communities and a grassroots level, communities that suddenly discover the church is indispensable to its local good. It has become this beautiful community of people that whatever. And I think there's a part of me thinks it's very sexy getting involved in national conversations and prophesying this, that, and the other, but actually where we're going to make the transformation is at our local level, and in those beautiful communities, in those relationships. And
I think there's something very Baptist about that, isn't it? You know,
yeah.
Our
ecclesiology lends itself to that.
Local. And I think, again, this is where I think often when we think about politics, we still think about what's going on at Westminster, rather than thinking about what's going on in my local council or and sometimes my local ward even, perhaps, you know. And actually that's where each church is called to engage. It's not that I don't think that means we completely dissent from what's going on at Westminster or Holyrood or whatever it might be, but that can't be everything when it comes to politics. You know, this is where I think Luke Brotherton is quite helpful. You know, that politics is just about how we live together, and that always has a local, national, international kind of dimension to it. I think often we focus only on the national, and I guess international dominates, but we feel very powerless, I guess, about international stuff often. But we don't pay enough attention to the local, where perhaps there is more power, and I mean this in a not in a power to dominate, but power to be heard and to shape and to contribute, to mold, perhaps to use. Although that's an interesting word, I think that Nigel uses there, mold. I think that probably isn't a word. I wonder if he would want to use that word anymore, because I do think the voice of the church and the witness of the church needs to be a much more humble one than it has been in the past. Because I think then it actually begins to get heard more, because we're not here to mold perhaps, but just to, would shape be better? I don't know. Or is it the same word? Yeah.
I think it's the same word, Andy.
Yeah, sorry, I'll have to work on it for something else.
I was thinking about this peacekeeping function, and one of the best things I ever did was start street pastors in Greenwich. And it provided a really interesting space where we, as church leaders, negotiated between local council and police about our community. And the police loved us because we helped them. And the council were a little wary of giving us money because we were one faith group rather than multiples. But they did in the end. They funded the Street Pastors programme. And I found that quite an interesting intersection, really. And it was the most translatable benefit for people outside of the church that the church was doing. So every person that I talked to about street pastors, who if they're an atheist or not, or something else, understood the value of a chaplaincy presence on the streets in order to maintain peace and bring peace and hope when, I'm not just talking about the frivolous things about street pastors, giving out flip-flops and things like that, but actually about bringing peace to quite troubled streets. We started it because there was a kid murdered on the doorstep of the church, pretty much. And so it was about trying to engage with that violence and change it. And I felt that was a very positive ecumenical endeavour. I will say that the Bishop of Woolwich, in a different conference, said he started the Greenwich Street Pastors scheme. And I was at the conference, and I don't know how I didn't stand up and say, "Oi!" But anyway, there you go. Bless
our dear Church of England brothers and sisters. Yeah.
Yes.
But I do, and again, I think that's the gift of the church. I don't think it's a gift that cannot be found in other communities. But one of the gifts of the church is we can have the imagination to contribute to society in that way and in lots of other ways, which sometimes I think the state sometimes lacks that imagination. Especially, I guess, and one of the things, isn't it, that I think we've seen in that I think was a problem with the New Labour one, and potentially as it's been a problem since, is the kind of technocratic kind of we'll set targets and policies and things like this. That doesn't give the room for imagination and the freedom again, back to I think Nigel's language of free church, free state, to sometimes to find other ways of discovering the common good. That I guess that's a term that isn't found. I'm trying to think if it's there in the lecture. Nigel doesn't talk as much about, well, maybe he uses different language, but that I guess that's the other language that for me has appeared at least a lot more since the 2000s and 2010s. That's the language of the common good. How can we? That's Luke Brotherton language as well as others. I guess that's partly what Nigel's about, but he doesn't use that language, and I wonder whether he would use that more now. But yeah,
he uses it once on
right. Well
page
done.
15.
Good. Well done for spotting
but
that.
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Common good stuff that tends to come more from Catholic social teaching, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But I don't think it should be held by them. I think there's a lot there for,
I agree. I wrote a chapter on building a vision for the common good in a book called Reclaiming the Common Good.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, we've got to 9 o'clock. We can keep going for a few minutes, but if this feels like a natural stop, I think we need
been really quiet and patient and poised. I know whether they've got gems that they've got tucked away or whether they're just happy to.
Yes, David and James, now's your opportunity.
I'm very happy just to be receiving the gems this evening. I was very conscious listening to everyone's reflections that, I mean, we were given Free Church, Free State, Nigel's book, as a bit of a textbook when we were at Spurgeon's, and the idea that you would not think everything that Nigel's written in this lecture was an anathema to those of us who were studying when he was the principal. So in a way, this was sort of all, well, of course. So it's been interesting to hear some of the other reflections on it tonight, because I think that I mean, for me, if the Church of England was disestablished, I think there's questions to answer about whether we need all the denominations that we currently have. I mean, that's the main reason I'm not an Anglican, is that the church is established.
David, I guess my other thing, before James, you bring some final pearls of wisdom, you've also contributed as a Baptist representative at party conferences. Yeah. I wonder if that has brought another perspective. Does that bring a perspective in how you think about politics and some of these issues?
Yes, I mean, one of the main reflections always, though, is that it humanizes the whole thing when you sit across the table from people, and also just the huge diversity within each party as well. They're very, and all have very different approaches to faith within them. One of reflecting on something Rob was saying a bit earlier, I would posit that the government would say they are listening to religious communities, but the ways in which they're listening to them are not things where I would want to agree with what the church is saying. So the reason why conversion therapy isn't illegal in this country is because churches have nobbled the government to say this is a freedom of speech issue, for example. So often the voice with which the church speaks is one where I think, well, that's not what I want to say. So there's great diversity within that, but I think they are listening. I think that's part of the problem, and makes it even more of a challenge. But the conferences are a wonderful experience, and meeting some great people at all of them.
Yeah, well, I think that lends itself again that this whole Nigel's word ambiguous. It's messy, but it's also human. I think that's a helpful thing. And I guess again, we could just avoid those places. Whereas I think Nigel is always, his argument has been that he calls us into those places as the church, to be the church, and recognizing that the church, I think, David, as you just kind of wanted to hint at, the church is a diverse group again. It's not one thing. It's made up of a great diversity of voices within it. And that's the challenge. Yeah. James, did anything that you wanted to say?
It's certainly not a pearl of wisdom. But whilst we've been talking, I've been thinking about the bit kind of pages 24, 25. Nigel seems to want to be saying to the state effectively, get back in your box and understand your own limitations and carve out a kind of spiritual sphere of religious conviction and belief in which the state can't intrude or encroach or shouldn't be allowed to. And I get why he's doing that in terms of freedom of religion and so on. But I find myself wondering off the back of that, firstly, is it possible to distinguish the spiritual and temporal spheres in that way? Can we really separate them so distinctly so that the church can have one and the state the other? What happens when those spheres collide and religious convictions and belief do impinge on justice and peace? And David raised conversion therapy. That's possibly a good example. COVID and the closing of churches might be another, without really wanting to open those two cans of worms tonight. And to make that argument, does that not open the door for the state to say, oh, fair enough, we'll look after the worldly stuff and you get back in your spiritual box? And you look after that, we'll look after the worldly stuff, and stop talking about politics and justice and peace because it's none of your business. That's our job here. I'll say, not pearls of wisdom, just...
I think it raises a good question. Ed would.
I think that's really interesting. I think it comes back to Simon's point about theology and what direction do we go in? Do we begin with God as the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, revealed most perfectly in Christ, and say, what is the nature of God? as revealed in Christ, and take it from there. So issues of peace and justice and life and love and compassion and service and all those kind of things, so I'm a great believer in, I think we are often getting into a mess because our basic theology, our understanding about the nature of God is skewed. And if only we truly believed in God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, it would change so much.
But that's where I think I still want a humbler faith, because that sense of being able to define God completely and wholly and without any kind of problems is so difficult and challenging. Which says to me, just as Nigel's calling for a more limited state, in a similar way, he also wants to say there's a limited church, because the church cannot. He doesn't think the church can only witness. And I think the interesting thing is the witness can go both ways. And this goes back to the Luke Brotherton thing, actually. It's not actually that the church just witnessed to the state, but actually the state and all sorts of different other groups can witness to the church. And in the mix of that, perhaps the kingdom of God is sometimes discovered, although it remains ambiguous and messy, and it's the wheat and the tares and all that kind of stuff. So perhaps, whether Nigel says that clearly there, I think, for me, I think the free church, free state is helpful. I think you're right, James, that there's a danger that we divide the spiritual from the temporal, or whatever, or however there's a dualism there that is unhelpful.
I was thinking specifically in terms, is it Bonhoeffer who talks about, where you see, injustice, it's all very well. I don't know, I can't remember the illustration, but if a car's coming down the road and keeps knocking people over, it's all very well rescuing people after they've been run over. But what you need to do is go and stop the cars freewheeling down the road. And it's fundamental issues of justice that we derive from the nature of God. In a sense, in the beginning is justice. So we have to go back up the road. And that's where we become, I think, subversive, but also controversial. If somebody's polluting the rivers, you have to go back and find out where it's coming in the river, and it's that kind of thing. And you don't do it with any great kind of fanfare or we know and you don't and all the rest of it. But it's just out of compassion for what is going on before your eyes. It's like food banks. We feel very wonderful about running food banks, and it's a very necessary thing. But the subversive question is, why have we got food banks? And that's the prophetic thing as well, I think, that we derive from the nature of God, that everybody should be fed and so on.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to draw it to a close there. And I think in some way, we will find a way to say thank you to Nigel again for writing a stimulating lecture, which continues to stimulate us all these years on. As I said, I think Nigel's voice on these issues should mean that Baptists should be engaging with them, talking to them more. So if you're watching this afterwards and haven't read the lecture, go away and read the lecture, and perhaps we need to find other places to engage in these kind of questions. Not to suggest that there are any simple answers, but I also want to thank you all those who joined in the conversation this evening to make it such a rich and interesting one. So thank you. And if you're back around, I think it's something like the 22nd of Feb, he says, or is it, no, the 20th of Feb, which I know for some is half term, but we're going to go for it anyway. We're going to be engaging with the next lecture in the series, which was Ruth Goldwyn's lecture, Reinventing the Wheel. And if you're able to join us, that should be another interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Right.